Alright, in this video, we're just going to cover the steps that we were going to go through whenever we do a hypothesis test. The first set of steps we're going to look at are ones that are going to be true for every hypothesis test we do throughout the course. So when you're thinking ahead to tests and thinking about trying to, in a sense, memorize the steps, these are the 5 steps you want to look through because it's going to be true for any hypothesis test that we do. So, our 5 steps are going to be the first, state our hypotheses with symbols and numbers. This means I'm going to come up with what my HO should be and my HA should be. So determine what those should be. My second step is going to be to create my decision rule, which will look the same every single time. So I am going to reject my null hypothesis and instead believe my alternative hypothesis if my probability, or now what we're calling p-value, is small. And we determine small is less than our alpha, that significance level that we defined previously. So remember, we're always going to reject when the probability is small. Step 3 is when you're going to check your conditions and calculate your test statistic. Right now that equates to looking at what we did for a sampling distribution for checking conditions and then calculating our test statistic depending upon our data. Step 3, the conditions and the formula for your test statistic will always be on your formula sheet. So a lot of students like to think of step 3 as your formula sheet step. Step 4 is we need to calculate our p-value. And to calculate our p-value, we actually need 2 things to calculate our p-value. We need our test statistic that we would calculate above in step 3. And I need my alternative hypothesis sign. I need that so I know if it's a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test. And then if it's one-tailed, do I shade left or shade right? So in order to calculate that probability or p-value, I need to also know how I should be shading my picture, which I get from my alternative hypothesis. Then once we have that p-value, we can make our decision by going back up to step 2 and comparing our p-value now to our significance level that we will have. Finally, in step 5, we're going to write out our conclusion and do our interpretation. If you are someone looking at the book, just note that these are slightly different than how the book presents them. And we're talking about how do I actually write this conclusion. So I kind of have a sample, generic looking one here, which will probably make more sense as we do our first example. But again, so what you're seeing on this upper part of your page is generic steps for a hypothesis test. So true for every hypothesis test we will do throughout the semester. Below that, you have what they're going to look like in this specific instance when we're talking about a categorical variable. So we're going to look at how those 5 steps look related to this specific test. So our null hypothesis is going to be that p equals p0. So when you actually are doing the hypothesis test, this p0 will actually be a number. So in previous examples, we've had, for example, p equals 0.5 or p equals 0.3. So that will actually be a number when we're doing a hypothesis test. But the thing I want you to point out is there's always this equal sign there. You do not get a choice in that sign. For the alternative, there's actually 3 options that I have labeled as A, B, and C. This p0 that you see, though, in each of them is the same as the p0 that you have there. We just have to determine if you're going to do that not equal to, the less than, or the greater than. And how do I decide that? I'm going to have to read the problem to determine what the motivation is. Do I want to see that there's less than 50% heads? Do I want to see that there's more than 50% heads? Or do I think it's just different than 50% heads? So I'm going to have to read the problem to determine which sign I'm going to use in my alternative hypothesis. Step 2 is exactly what it was just above, but it's good practice for us to write this. So again, I'm going to reject the null hypothesis and instead then believe the alternative hypothesis if our p-value, which again is our new fancy name for our probability, is less than our significance level, which will be alpha. Step 3, we're going to look at our conditions attached to doing a proportion test. So these are very similar to what we saw in our sampling distribution notes. We need that relatively random and unbiased sample. Before, we had n times p was at least 10, and n times 1 minus p was at least 10. What you'll see is there's this little 0 on your p. And really the only reason that is there is for you to know where to go. So this p0 that you use is the same value that you have up here in that null hypothesis. Assuming my conditions are met, then I can calculate my z. This is going to look very similar to what we had in our sampling distribution, and in fact I'm going to write it out that way first. So hopefully this formula looks familiar. The only thing that I'm going to change on it is this p. I'm going to put that little 0 on there again, and that's mainly to remind you where that number is coming from. So that little 0 being on there, there's a little 0 on my HO, right? So those kind of zeros match up to let you know where to get that number from. Then, based upon my value I get for my z, and which sign I have in my alternative hypothesis, I will be able to calculate my p-value and then make my comparison up here to make my decision. And then I will be able to make my conclusion and interpretation. So that's just what the steps look like. What you'll see is I'm going to take these 5 steps for our first example and actually break it up into 3 smaller videos going through the steps a little bit more slowly that way and break it up. So we're going to apply these steps to an example in the next video.